Need for Speed, a name synonymous with street racing, hyper-powered streetcars, and even high-speed chases. While some racing franchises have focused more on realism or offering a proper racing circuit format, Need for Speed was unique in that it was more focused on all things street. Need for Speed World, which launched on PC back in 2010 and was developed by EA Black Box, despite the IP not being particularly multiplayer focused, the game was able to actually garner quite the impressive initial audience, reaching 1 million users in quite a short time. However, just after 4 years and some change, Need for Speed World, or NFSW, alongside some other slew of online titles, ones we covered already in the series, for example like Battlefield Heroes, would be shut down. Need for Speed World was the closest thing that Need for Speed fans had to a full-fledged MMO, which has made many people request it as a title on the Death of a Game series, a series where we cover the largest contributing factors to a particular game or company's death and chronicle them using the use of a timeline, finally culminating in a final deduction, which is every detective's favorite thing. Make sure to pay attention to the clues alongside the way, but if you miss any, don't worry, I got you covered at the end of things. So, why did Need for Speed World die? Need for Speed was a very successful franchise in the early 2000s, spawning multiple titles over the course of nearly a decade. Need for Speed, however, hadn't done much in the way of multiplayer yet, and with the rise of MMOs and MMORPGs in the 2000s, it seemed like EA, who was already dabbling in the genre with other IPs and titles, wanted to try their hand with their Need for Speed IP next. That would mean something akin to a racing MMO, which hadn't really been attempted very many times, well, except by the same company, EA, and using the same franchise, Need for Speed, though dubbed something different. Motor City Online had been covered in this series already and had its own share of issues. This meant that it had learned some important lessons, hopefully. The beta for Need for Speed World would happen March 2010, and a number of details would be revealed there. Need for Speed World would allow players to visit old regions and tracks, as well as drive a number of classic vehicles too, totaling at over 100 licensed vehicles. Along with new playable regions, plans are in place to regularly add cars, social features, and game modes. And the impetus behind the new content will be the user base. Fan feedback will be incorporated into development. For me, I actually found this to be quite worrying. If you're actually creating an MMO and thus a world, you have to build social mechanics and features into the game from the start. Adding them later based on feedback just doesn't make any sense. However, there were some very worrying aspects being presented too. The game is going towards Need for Speed roots, its classic Need for Speed. It's all about racing, but with some cool, unique, modern strategy added to it. Wait a minute, it would be difficult to actually chase Need for Speed's roots when attempting Mario Kart level power-ups. Yep, that's actually what they ended up with. I actually found this to be quite bizarre, because if the idea is leveraging the actual IP at the time, with a racing MMO, why aren't you leveraging it properly? I don't know any Need for Speed players of the time who were asking for power-ups is all I'm saying. The beta first actually took place in Taiwan, and thus Asia, and if you pay attention to the footage on screen, you can see that it not only featured EA Singapore assisting on the project, there was actually localization stuff created just for the Asian audience. They literally created an entirely different look and feel. For example, even the toll booths from Most Wanted made an appearance. So there was gameplay differences too. While I laud this, especially for the time, as many localizations are quite lazy and just change the text and translate it, and thus pay no attention to the cultural differences needed to make a game or virtual world work in another market, I kind of feel like there must have been tons of resources devoted to this, and they weren't even sure if they had a serious audience in Asia. Especially for the time when, even still today, China largely doesn't have that big of an MMORPG or MMORPG audience. But they very likely could have just been testing the waters in China, especially with the major publishing office at the time being located in Singapore. Adopting a unique business model, Need for Speed World would be free to play up to level 10 and require a $20 purchasable game pack to make it to max level, which was level 50. Although it seemed like the game was free to play, in reality the free to play aspects were just a demo, which actually hampers how many players can get involved. This was a common misunderstanding that many game developers were going through at the time who were inexperienced in MMOs. Need for Speed World would launch July 27, 2010 on Windows only. Rock Paper Shotgun, who would review the title, would have the following conclusion about their time spent playing the game. The process of grinding this far was mostly tedious, which is immensely frustrating as there's clearly a solid online race here. The first couple of times with a course are often great. After that, familiarity breeds contempt, and the AI and lag issues become the focal point. If they'd only bothered to put more features in or into it, this would be worth celebrating. Instead, it's sparse to the point of barren with a horrible lack of ideas. It is claimed that more shall be added as the time goes on, with larger updates every 2 to 3 months. So perhaps in 6 to 9 months' time, when the game's been given the content it should have obviously had at launch, perhaps it will make use of its engine. For now, it's echoingly empty, madly repetitive, and often infuriating. Back up the content lorry, empty its load, and then we'll come back. The Metacritic overall reception wasn't much better, with many people calling the game pay to win, criticizing the gameplay itself, and more. Regardless, just a few months later, and the game had reached 1 million players, which was pretty impressive all things considered, and was a certainly workable sized population. The core of the game, which was based kind of on Need for Speed Carbon, and also later on Need for Speed Most Wanted, was actually serviceable, just like Motor City Online. EA Black Box, who had been rebranded to Quick Lime Games in response, would open up the $20 cap and make the full game free to play. While this seemed like a natural decision, the bad news would be that the microtransactions would likely need to be increased to compensate. And while that's normal in the virtual world space, it's not quite normal for racing games. For example, the Need for Speed franchise normally allows for full customizability in early games without spending even a dime. And when you compare a typical Need for Speed game to Need for Speed World, it just feels like a bad bargain. A normal Need for Speed game has not only single-player features and an entire storyline dedicated to it, it also doesn't have microtransactions. For many Need for Speed fans, there's not a whole lot of reason for them to play World. As I mentioned, Quick Lime Games would release aftermarket parts March 16, 2011, increasing the monetization. These would change the racing skill system and build the customization, and thus the monetization, around the vehicle and the parts themselves. While this makes some logical sense, from a business perspective again, it further cheapens the Need for Speed World experience, which already had power-ups if you remembered. Who even was the target audience, I guess? Further monetization of Need for Speed World was only going to continue to push players away, especially as it still seemed to not have any new content. Another serious issue taking hold at the time was the hacking. Motor City Online sadly was also plagued by this. Hackers can easily ruin racing games because the entire objective is getting the fastest time, and if they hack to the fastest time in any sort of way, well, then they win the race. Either Quick Lime Games had no idea how to stop the hackers, or it was just too late, and they never had such in mind when they were building the game, which means that they didn't learn from Motor City Online. It was unsure, but hackers ran rampant in Need for Speed World and virtually ruined the game when it's so inherently competitive and it has an economy system. Which means losing isn't just annoying, it's also not getting paid the money you need to further the customization or advancement of your vehicle. Need for Speed World would finally expand April 19, 2011. The bizarre thing was, the update was essentially just boiled down to a new mode and more customization, aka monetization options. Huzzah! This was not significant enough of an update to give the game the momentum it needed to not falter early, and it didn't do any of the sort that was promised by the team upon receiving the player feedback, like all the player interaction and socialization in the game that was just lacking. In fact, it was even made worse in a bizarro way I have never seen or even heard explanation for. Free play was just removed. Free play was where you could drive around the map in Need for Speed World, and it was just removed. Now the game, if not already feeling that way, felt even more like a glorified queue simulator, more than a racing world. IGN, who would rate the game a 6 out of 10, would state that in a nutshell, Need for Speed World is an online racer masquerading as an MMO, where there is very little player interaction at all. The open world is a glorified queuing system, and there is far too much grinding between upgrades and far too little difference between the upgrades themselves. No doubt the game will have content updates in the future that add much more interesting components. There is little means of interacting with the ones who are around, and little to keep players grinding towards their next levels. In essence, the world was missing. And Need for Speed World. And players and journalists alike were feeling that. There was no reason to be in the world when not repeating the repetitive grind-focused races in a hope to buy the parts you needed to upgrade your car without spending money, to just continue to race. And worlds aren't just about monetization either. There's so much more, and it was all missing in Need for Speed World. I think it should be worth mentioning that talent and experience can also be a big culprit in such a situation, especially when working on such difficult types of projects, which are MMOs or virtual worlds. It seems like the team that was involved in Need for Speed World had no experience in online gaming and no experience in virtual worlds. And the majority of the main development team would go on to work on either failed games or nothing at all. So even if they had the resources in a popular IP, they didn't really have the right team to pull it off, like many other failed virtual worlds of the time. Quicklime Games would shut down altogether April 25th, 2013. This was part of an extensive restructure in EA, which would lead to the complete closure of the Vancouver studio. Easy Studios, behind Battlefield Heroes, another title that we also covered on the series, would now be in charge of the maintenance for Need for Speed World. Notice my usage of the M word, maintenance. That's because there was nearly no chance that the game would be making a serious comeback with an inexperienced developer who was barely surviving themselves. Once a virtual world reaches the maintenance status, it nearly never returns from it, existing as a sort of limbo before just dying outright. No new content is really churned out, and if it is, it's super pared down and delayed. It didn't mean anything good for Need for Speed World, even if it managed to keep living. Need for Speed World was shut down nearly 2 years later, which was pretty impressive in a sense. It was shut down with a slew of other online titles, with no sign of comeback. Managing to live 2 more years was impressive, but kind of wasn't in the sense that it was just a hobbled state, since it got no major new updates. During the time that Need for Speed was alive though, EA had launched like 4 to 5 different Need for Speed titles, and most of them were successful. Most Wanted and Rivals and so on. So although the IP's online title was faltering seriously, the franchise still remained largely successful, which always opened up the possibility that there could be another online-focused title, though perhaps not the racing world that many of us have wanted for many years. Need for Speed would take 2 years following its shutdown to receive some private server playing options, which is a testament to the community wanting to keep the game alive, and oftentimes a sign that the audience itself felt wronged by the title's attempt or its shutdown. Since the monetization was such a large part of the game's issue according to the fanbase, theoretically the game would be allowed to breathe through the use of private server play. Soapbox Race World, which is a goated name I should add, allowed for browsing through a server list, a custom economy, and was easy to use with the download of a launcher. Alongside custom content, Soapbox Race World is easily the best way to experience Need for Speed World in 2024, and shout out to those who kept yet another virtual world alive. Something I really felt worth mentioning, especially because I talked about EA Black Box and then Quicklime Games not being fit for the task of creating a racing world. Well, to be fair, they didn't totally want to. During the time that they were starting development on the project and what would be their next project, they had been heading the Need for Speed franchise up entirely. That helm was then split between Criterion Games and Slightly Mad Studios. The former would create Hot Pursuit, and the latter, Shift. It almost feels like Black Box Games' team was square pegged into a circle, and that also contributed to their inability to pull the game off. Especially when during the development, they also traded said development back and forth a few times. In many ways, Need for Speed World felt like a doomed project from the beginning. We have reached the end of our timeline, which means we have gathered enough clues and bits of evidence along the way. Everybody, with that music playing, it's time for me to do every detective's favorite, final deduction. Why did Need for Speed World die? Well, it had a lack of player interaction and connectivity. An inexperienced and incorrect team for the job. It had a heavy Need for Speed shadow. Hackers, they kind of ruin everything, trust me, I know. Microtransactions galore. Uncharted territory. Now the last point might seem wrong because didn't I say Motor City Online was also a thing? And even then, the crew existed, right? And still exists. But the first 2 games that I mentioned didn't have free roam, and the crew only allows for 7 players to free roam. But quite honestly, a full free roam racing world with content that you can sign up for or in groups doesn't really exist. I mean, in some ways, APB, All Points Bulletin, allowed for more than just 7 players to drive around, right? But you get what I'm saying. There's always a catch, or something just seriously missing from it. This is still really just uncharted territory, and uncharted territory I would love to see charted, especially with the rise of F1 and racing simulators in general. But not only is the racing audience massive and continues to grow, I still think that there is a lingering desire to see such a thing. I don't know who's going to be able to pull it off, but I think that it probably would come from one of the key holders of the major racing franchises. The Crew, for example, came out with yet another title, The Crew Motorfest, and it has a modicum of success offering some of the stuff that we have outlined here. But still, there just hasn't quite been that racing world. Thanks for watching, detectives.